Hello, Megalithomaniacs. We're back here with Andrew Collins, and today we're going to be talking about Karahan Tepe. Now, one of the reasons we wanted to have this little meetup and discussion and share it with you is because of a winter solstice alignment that myself and JJ Ainsworth discovered back in December 2021 on the winter solstice. But Andrew came over with us in 2022 to observe it directly himself, and it's part of the research for a new book he's writing, as well as we wanted to go and have a look at this and hopefully some other sites in the area to see what else we could observe there. And I personally spent 3 mornings there in December 2022. Andrew came as well for a couple of those, and we think, it's not only is it a fascinating, remarkable discovery, but what else has now come to light since then is getting even more compelling. And also the fact that even before this, Andrew had discovered a summer solstice sunset alignment linked with one of the enclosures there, which we're going to talk about as well here. So it's all coming out already. So it's almost like as soon as Karahan Tepe has been excavated, it's been happening since 2019. Discoveries are being made linked with the sky, the sun, the moon, and the stars, amongst other things. And considering so little has been excavated, what else is going to come out is no doubt going to be mind-blowing. It's featured heavily in a new episode of Ancient Aliens. You can see that on the History Channel. It should be available to watch now. And we feature in it. We were the guests at the site, talking about the site, showing the TV crew around. It's also featured in Graham Hancock's Ancient Apocalypse TV show on Netflix as well. So I think 2023 is going to become like the year of Karahan Tepe. It's all going to come out. More excavations going to be done. More discoveries are going to be made. And thankfully, we were there to witness this solstice alignment, because we don't know if they're going to build a roof over it, if it's going to block it. So we made the effort. We went there, and we're going to have a little talk about that now and give you an update on what both Andrew and I and what JJ as well have been doing. So, hey, Andrew, how's it going?
Yeah, it's good. Yeah, I mean, just so much to talk about in connection with Karahan Tepe. And as each month goes by, we're finding out even more. And for me, right now, this place is more exciting than Gobekli Tepe. I mean, obviously, I spent literally decades working, on Gobekli in various ways. Obviously, it features in various of my books. But obviously, I'd always had one eye on Karahan, since 2004. I mean, that's the first time I went there immediately after I found it existed. And it was in this little old guidebook that was sold to me secondhand by some kids at the ancient city of Haran, which is not far away. And I just saw a picture of one of the T pillars found there, which has this weird looking snake on the side of it. And I just thought, I've got to go there. I just need to get there. So, I tracked it down, went to the site, and of course, it was unexcavated. There were T pillars just sticking up above the surface everywhere. And it's clear that this was the sister site of Gobekli Tepe, simply because of its size. And we now know, actually, that it could even be 6 times the size of Gobekli Tepe. That's what they're suggesting now. So this is like a city. This is not just some kind of small settlement. This is something that could rival, let's say, Çatalhöyük, a later Neolithic urban centre in southern central Turkey. I mean, so it's just extraordinary. But beyond that is the fact that we're both Hugh, myself, and JJ, we're finding incredible astronomical alignments associated with sites. And these alignments almost certainly go back 11,000 years to 9,000 BC. Making this the earliest place aligned to the sun anywhere in the world. I mean, when I say, aligned to the sun, I mean, there are alignments to the stars as well. But we certainly know that this site isn't as old as Göbekli Tepe. It probably is a few hundred years later, possibly by about 500, 600 years later, and could have been created as part of a breakaway group, I think, from Göbekli Tepe that really wanted to take things on to the next level, get really into deep shamanism and connect with what they saw as almost like the cosmic source of existence, really.
Yeah, for those that don't know, Andrew's written about this before. We've been writing about it recently as well. Is that it was discovered kind of officially in the mid 1990s by Bahattin Chelik, and we're going to discuss the name of it as well, which is a very interesting story in itself. But it was only in 2019 that it started to be properly excavated. There had been a few bits of looting going on there, but not much else. And I've been visiting there with Andrew since 2014. Andrew's been going there obviously 10 years previous to that as well. And so to get a chance to go there quickly after it had been excavated was quite something. And this happened to be in December, late December 2021, when me and JJ just decided to go over there and check it out. And as well as we knew some other sites were being excavated at the time. And we had this series of strange events that led us to being forced to go there first thing in the morning, not my favorite time of day, to witness. And we met to witness what was going on. And we managed to get there just after sunrise. Now, it was a little bit cloudy. The sun broke through at about 8 a.m., even though the sun had risen at 7:37 a.m. And we noticed this strip of light on the right-hand side of the face, or the left side, if you're looking at the stone face inside the pillar shrine or the AB pit. And it slowly moved around over a 30 to 40 minute period. We caught about 27 minutes of it on that visit, but we realized when we went back again the year later, December 2022, with Andrew, that it actually started earlier. It started hitting the far back of the head much earlier, only 10 minutes or so after sunrise. And so it's a lot closer to sunrise than we originally realized on our previous visit, partly because it was cloudy, partly because we turned up there a few minutes late. So now we realize, back, perhaps in 9000 BC, it was almost at the point of sunrise, very close to it now. And we also spotted as well, which we weren't able to see the previous year, you actually see the sunrise on the horizon at the time of sunrise. So it wasn't late, it wasn't hiding behind hills for a few minutes. It was virtually there at sunrise, 7:37 a.m. And so that was really interesting as well. We were able to kind of witness that. And as Andrew mentioned, the sun, comes through the porthole stone, which links the AB pit or the pillar shrine with the main enclosure AD, the 75-foot wide elliptical enclosure with all the megaliths and the stone benches that are on the western side. And that's when it illuminates the head over this period of time. And so clearly to us, we think it's a genuine alignment. We don't think it's a chance alignment. A lot of people have been telling me this, and I'm like, really? So to have something that you can directly observe in the modern era, and it would have been only very slightly different 11,000 or so years ago, less than a degree difference. It could have even been a better orientation, so more would get lit. And we've had Andrew and Rodney Hale look at this using Stellarium software and using archaeoastronomy data to kind of work this out. And between us, we think it works even back then. And the other interesting thing, before I want to get your feedback on this, Andrew, is the fact that the height of the sun as it rises at an angle stays below the level of what would probably be the tops of the T-pillars. So it'd almost rise between pillars, between the central T-pillars, rather than above them. And so this would indicate that there may have been an opening, or it was already open towards the southeast where the sun rises. And there's some other ideas about that we'll discuss, but we got Andrew to come with us. We're delighted we could all go together. We had some great new friends we met there who were showing us around. Ishmael was at the site, the family member. I think Andrew's known since he was a very young child. And we managed to get in there for 2 or 3 mornings consecutively, and the sun was shining every day in December 2022. It wasn't in December 21. We were lucky to even see it then. So just want to get your thoughts on it, and about the fact that you were able to witness it, and hopefully it'll be able to be witnessed by others in the years to come.
Yeah, I mean it's an extraordinary discovery. There's absolutely no question about that. And anybody that suggests it might be by chance is just being silly, I think. The reason I say that is that, it illuminates this head But if that structure, the pillar shrine, as we call it, had got a roof on it, which I'm pretty certain it has, because there are ledges on the west wall and on the east wall, which would have supported perhaps timber and perhaps something like an oxhide covering, then that sun entering through the porthole and hitting the head would not only have been spectacular, but once it ends, that's it. It doesn't hit any other part of the shrine. It doesn't illuminate those phallic-looking pillars. It doesn't illuminate the walls. It just illuminates the head. And I think this needs to be emphasized, that it's finely tuned as far as the creation of that particular structure for this process to take place. And that needs to be factored in here. It's not just some like random sweep through the interior of it. It's not. It hits one thing and one thing alone. And then when the sun angle is too acute for it actually to hit that head anymore, the sun disappears from the pillar shrine and only reappears, obviously, when it's so high that it can shine light down into the shrine. And of course, if it had a roof, that would have been meaningless anyway. So, that's the significance of this particular alignment. And the people that were constructing this, are alleged to be hunter-gatherers, that clearly were brought together by the local, shamans or whatever to create this monument. And as far as Western archaeologists are concerned, it's just like a few communal rooms that they probably did their ceremonies in or something or other. But I mean, the Turkish archaeologists have a different view. I mean, Nesmi Carroll has basically said, look, this was quite clearly some kind of initiatory process, which would probably have begun in the Great Ellipse, which is structure AD, possibly with some kind of festivity. People would have got into an altered state, or perhaps some chosen supplicant, and then that person would have moved through the porthole into the actual shrine itself, and they would have communed with either the great ancestors, or, as I suggest, the cosmic serpent itself, which I think is what the head represents. And the process would then have continued into the final shrine, in my opinion, which is the so-called pit shrine, which is structure AA, or as you, I think, referred to it as the unfinished shrine, although I think it's perfect. I don't think it's, it is unfinished. I think it's exactly the way that they wanted it. And so there was like a sort of some kind of experiential journey involved. And this is something that Nesmi Carroll himself suggests. And what he says is that whoever would have gone inside that pillar shrine as part of this journey would have come out completely changed. I mean, he actually says this in one of his videos. So what does he mean by that? Well, we can only but guess, but let's assume that we are talking about individuals, shamans, initiates, who were entering into a deep trance state, that these are shamanic journeys on a level which we can't really even imagine today. I mean, our only vision of shamans is New Age shamans, or, mad shamans who we see in Siberia or Mongolia. But quite clearly, 11,000 years ago, it would have been much rawer. But in addition to this, these people were incredibly hyper intelligent as well. They were creating the earliest rock architecture anywhere in the world. And this was functional. This was not simply somewhere where they wanted to play around on a Saturday night. They were doing something very special here. And I believe that it was associated with the synchronization with the movement of the sun and the cycles of heaven itself, to quite literally connect themselves with some kind of cosmic source in the shape of a serpent or snake.
That's fascinating. I mean, one of the there's a few other things we can jump into here. There's some new research that Andrew's done, which is going to share with us regarding what was seen in the night sky before the winter solstice sunrise, and he's also going to talk about the summer solstice sunset. and what was in the night sky after sunset. So as you say, it seems like it's this like two parts of the year have been marked precisely here. Now, this is obviously, this has a link with, as Andrew said, like shamanism, fertility practices, but JJ's done a lot of research on this idea that it's a sort of feminine site, or certainly a fertility site, and these may be representations of the way that the light, the male shard of light from the sun penetrates the female porthole stone. Then you have the phallic pillars, you have the water associated with it. And JJ's research on the work of Maria Gimbutas with all the cut marks and other symbolism does kind of suggest that. But before we talk about what was going on in the sky and the stars and the sun and even the moon, which we can talk about in a moment as well, it's the name of the site, which I think people will find fascinating, because Karahan Tepe is a relatively modern name created in the 1990s from a culmination of other sites. Whereas Gobekli Tepe, which is this hill which we've been visiting just to the north for many years, you've known about it for much longer than me, but it's got ruins on it, it's got caves on it. It's that name which was the original name of Karahan Tepe. So can we look at the root of that word and what that means?
Yeah, I mean, Karahan Tepe, as you just said, was not known by that name in the past. It's always been Gobekli or Gobekli Tepe. Now, Gobekli, according to the owners of the farm, the Khan family, relates to a Kurdish word that has the root ketch, which essentially means bald, basically. And they say that because nothing will grow on the summit of what we know today as Karahan Tepe, and yet coming up the sides of it is the soil that will turn green over the winter months, strangely enough, is that you would always see this bald head emerging out, and that would be the summit of Gobekli. However, the thing is that name was already present when the family and their ancestors reached the area. This is something that we've been able to confirm now. And therefore, their interpretation of that word may simply be to try and understand why it was called that. Because if you look at the word ketch, as in ketchup, not ketchup, but the way that it's pronounced, it actually is a Kurdish Kamanji word relating to female, woman, daughter. It can even mean queen. And therefore, this suggests that this was a female hill, the place of a female. And of course, we know many other hills in Europe, and I'm sure in other countries as well, that are named after, female bodies, basically. I mean, obviously, the Paps of Anna being a classic example in Ireland, or indeed somewhere like Callanish on the Isle of Lewis. If you look south, there is, the shapes of the hill, which also have a local name. I can't remember exactly what they are. You probably tell me. I've got it in the book somewhere, which are also, named after, a woman or a local goddess in the landscape. And there are many, many other examples, various examples in Greece, for instance. So I think it's a very strong possibility that what we know today as Karahan Tepe and the Northern Tepe, which is today called Gobekli Tepe. I know it's all confusing, but please go with us on this. Both of those hills are female, both of them. And by creating the rock architecture, you're quite literally going into the body of a female. And by doing this, you are entering through her into an otherworldly realm. Now, whether you use the caves, whether you use the structures, whether you do it symbolically, I mean, there is this strange vulva-shaped, carved area in the southeastern part of Karahan Tepe, which we were looking at in December. It's clearly carved. It only goes back about 4 or 5 feet, but it's clearly a vulva shape. There's no escaping from that. So it's almost like creating a vulva within the body of some kind of divine female. Well, who was she? Well, I think that she comes to be known in later Bronze Age tradition of Anatolia in the Near East as the goddess Ishara. Now, her primary form was a snake, but she also was another totem of her is the scorpion. And she was a personification of the constellation of Scorpius, or Scorpio, which forms perfectly into the alignments that we've found in connection with Karahan Tepe. I mean, obviously, you've talked about the midwinter, but earlier than obviously your discovery, and one of the reasons why you were out there for midwinter, seeing if anything happened then, was that I found a midsummer alignment in connection with the so-called pit shrine or structure AA, which, unlike the other two, the Great Ellipse and the Pillar Shrine, is on the northern end and just turned so that it looks towards the northwestern horizon. And when I first saw this, I looked at it and I thought, is that looking at something on the local horizon? And almost immediately I thought, is that looking at the sunset at midsummer? But of course, it's easy to say something like that. You need to get it checked out. So myself and engineer Rodney Hale started looking at this. And after a certain amount of two-weighing back and forth to try and, see if we could pin down the exact azimuth bearing of this structure, sure enough, it's within 1 degree of the setting of the sun at the time of midsummer, 9000 BC. And that's the chosen date that we're using, by the way. I mean, until radiocarbon dates do come out that tell us, more precisely exactly when the monument was created, then quite clearly, we have to generalize. And from every statement that's been made from Nesmi Carroll and also from Bahatin Chelik, based on his research at the site, 9000 BC makes a lot of sense. But the thing is that this was great. So you had an alignment towards sunset at midsummer. But I continued to play with Stellarium, click in the thing, see what happened as it got dark. And I was absolutely amazed to find that just 2 to 2.5 hours after sunset, at the exact spot where the sun actually disappears, suddenly in front of you, you see the Milky Way raised up vertically, and right at the base of it, where it hits the horizon, is what's known as the southern termination of the Dark Rift. The Dark Rift is an area of darkness that goes up the center of the galactic plane, from there to the star Deneb in the constellation of Cygnus, which quite separately we found another alignment which we won't worry about at the moment to do with Karahan. And here on the right, you've got the constellation of Ophiuchus, the serpent bearer or the snake charmer. And on the left, you've got Sagittarius. And Scorpius would be just below the horizon at this point, having set exactly alongside the sun. But what you're seeing with this southern termination of the Milky Way, the Milky Way's dark rift, is the age-old entrance into the other world, the sky world, the underworld, that is recognized by cultures all the way around the world. I mean, not just in the Eurasian continent, but also in the Americas. I mean, in Hamlet's Mill, the book Hamlet's Mill, which was the whole thing about precession and the importance of different, gateways on the Milky Way and whatever. They talk about what they call essentially the Scorpionic Gateway, in the vicinity of Scorpius being recognized by various indigenous peoples of South America, for instance. So this is not simply something that we find in Anatolia in the Near East. And I think that this was incredibly important. But surrounding that is the actual galactic bulge, which is the center of, which marks the center of our own Milky Way galaxy. And in various ancient cultures, this was the head of a snake. a snake, which was the Milky Way as a whole. And quite clearly, if this was seen as some kind of celestial intelligence, you're not going to be looking towards the tail to communicate with it, or the body. You're going to be looking towards the head. So I think that the alignment at midsummer was to set up communication with the head of this cosmic serpent, a cosmic serpent that eventually becomes very much embroiled with a lot of the religions of the Near East, and eventually will resurface in a lot of the Gnostic faiths, the so-called Orphite faiths of places like Palestine, Anatolia, Syria, in the early centuries of the Christian era. And I demonstrate how all of this is brought together, and you're dealing with exactly the same thing. This cosmic force, this celestial intelligence that is seen in terms of a serpent that is seen to be almost like a hypercosmic entity in its own right that creates the physical universe. And I think that all of this began at places like Karahan, specifically 11,000 years ago. And we can see this from just so much of the serpent imagery that's coming up from that site. Even new artifacts that have been found in the last year, once again, serpents everywhere. And to me, I think that if you can associate one particular constellation with the whole of Karahan, it's Scorpius, no question at all.
So this is absolutely fascinating to me. So that, we're really starting to kind of get a sense of the skyscape going back, 11,000 years. There's some more things we can discuss in a moment. I want to talk about what was seen at the night of the winter solstice before the sunrise, or the night after, whatever, because there's some really interesting things there. But I also want to mention the moon here as well, because we did a bit of research on this. You wrote, and Rodney, I asked you to look into where would the moon be. It's very difficult to sort of detect the movement of the moon going back 11,000 years. But in a general sense, we know, and this is proven over and over again, at the time of the summer solstice, around that time at least, the moon would follow the same path as the winter solstice sun, more or less. And so it would have reached a position, and you worked this out, to 9015 BC, 11,015 years ago, where the moon would have been in the same position as the sun, very close to full, so would have illuminated the head through the porthole stone back then, around the time, not as maybe exactly, but around the time of the summer solstice at night. And so I find this really interesting, that there may be a lunar connection with the site as well, especially with JJ's research, which she's finding all these feminine aspects to the site and linking it with the work of Maria Gimbutas and much earlier Paleolithic goddess traditions and so forth. And even the later stories we have from, as you've written about before, the Sumerians with Ninhursag or Ninlil, and the fact that she was a vegetation goddess, also a birthing goddess. She was often referred to and linked with serpents as well, and things like this. We're going to, myself and JJ, have a second article on Graham Hancock's website, which will feature all this. And so there's a lot to consider. So, but as you mentioned, the Milky Way and the nighttime of the summer solstice after the sunset, you were talking to me before the interview about something going on in the sky in a kind of similar way, in the direction of the eastern area of the sky. So again, imagine you're sitting on the stone benches because in the main enclosure you've got these giant megalithic thrones, almost they look like to me. You can imagine the kind of astronomer priestly elite sitting there gazing out towards the east and the southeast and so forth, seeing things in the nighttime, which we're going to talk about, but also then the winter solstice sunrise occurring in the same general area of the sky. So what were you finding at night at the time of the winter solstice?
Yeah, well, I mean, this was something you asked me to look at a long while ago. You said, is there anything that you can, work out in connection with the night sky, just prior to sunrise at the time of midwinter, 9000 BC or thereabouts. And at first I couldn't find anything because I was just simply looking in where the sun itself would rise. You know, in other words, any stars that would have been seen just before the sunrise. And there wasn't anything that really struck out. So I left it for a while. But then I started to realize, well, hold on, it may not be in the direction of the rising sun that they were looking, because the great ellipse itself is orientated almost perfectly towards the east. I mean, it's a few degrees out, but let's not worry about that at the moment. So, as you quite rightly said, you'd be, you know, let's say we're looking at dignitaries, you know, maybe local leaders of the community or whatever it is, looking due east. Well, what happens on the night of the midwinter solstice in 9000 BC and for various hundred years afterwards is that as you wait after the sun set and darkness falls, the Milky Way just gradually rises up exactly due east until it is right in front of you. In other words, it's perfectly horizontal on the horizon, but smack right in front of you, due east, is the galactic bulge, the center of our Milky Way galaxy. And right by its side, vertically upwards, is the constellation of Scorpius, which is the spirit of this cosmic serpent. If the cosmic serpent itself is the Milky Way, the head is the galactic bulge, Scorpius itself is almost like a personification of that. And this is so striking that when I first saw it, I thought, oh my God, I mean, why have we not noticed this before? So this is exactly what those dignitaries, those shamans, you know, whoever they were that were sitting on those thrones and looking out would view on the night of the winter solstice. And then, of course, you know, a few hours later, the sun will eventually take away that darkness and the sun will rise and will send that ray of light through the porthole and illuminate the head inside the pillar shrine. And that head, to me, is another representation of the cosmic serpent itself. And therefore, we can associate the cosmic serpent with both the summer solstice now and the winter solstice at Karahan Tepe, which I think is just extraordinary stuff. I mean, it's just like, could you imagine finding something like this just a few years ago at Karahan? I mean, what's so weird, I mean, and we're talking amongst friends here, so I can say this, is that when I was at Karahan for the first time in 2004, there was a broken T-pillar on the ground. It was only quite a small one. And I wanted to feel underneath it to see if there was any, you know, carving on it. And I was sort of feeling underneath, and I was there with this burly Kurdish driver that we were with, and he just sort of like lifted it up and turned it over. And right where my hand was a scorpion, a blue scorpion, a big blue scorpion. I mean, I've got a photograph of it. I'm going to put it in the book. And obviously it stunned me because I thought, oh my God, I mean, if that had stung me, I mean, I could have been killed. And it played on my mind. And when I came back from Karahan, you know, I had this huge download happen, connecting with Gobekli Tepe, which I ended up, you know, believing was connected with Cygnus, which obviously turned out to be the case, was verified by 2 Italian archaeoastronomers quite recently. But what I wrote down, I scribbled down at the time in this huge download, is that Karahan Tepe was the place of Scorpius. It's the place of the scorpion. And although clearly this was triggered by my, you know, by my encounter with a real life scorpion, for some reason that's proved to be the correct. And I mean, you know, it's just strange how all this stuff comes together. It's almost like you're given clues along the way, but it takes, you know, literally decades for it all to come together.
No, that's fascinating. That is, you come up with some predictions which kind of blow my mind. I mean, you even like, I know you were a long time ago before it was excavated at Karahan Tepe, we visited over numerous occasions from 2014 for myself, you much earlier. And you said it's the northern knoll where there's the alignment going through the northern hill, Ketchley, which debate about the name now.
Yeah.
That's where Cygnus would set 9,000 BC or so.
Yeah.
And you chose the spot
Yeah.
where it would go from, which happened to be where they excavated and found the enclosures, which have now been exposed now. So that little prediction I found really interesting. There are a few more than that, but I find that particularly interesting that you had this connection with a scorpion on your first ever visit, and Scorpius came in your mind, and now it's proving to be the case. So everyone listen to Andrew if he's got predictions about these ancient sites. He comes up with them. There's other elements to the sites in that all the areas. Well, one of the things we were talking about is the way they carved the bedrock here. It's very interesting. And this is also interesting because there's been a few years ago, I just came across this thanks to Matt from Ancient Architects, and there's a paper being written about it, about Jericho in Israel having a summer solstice sunset alignment. Again, the same, not exactly the same, although it's a bit later, because Jericho, I think the earliest phase is 8,500 BC, maybe 8,300 BC. So it would have been after Karahan Tepe. But when the paper came out a few years ago, they were claiming this is the oldest solstice alignment on the planet. So I find that intriguing, that the data is starting to kind of all blend together in this whole Tepela region, but further afield as well at slightly later dates.
Yeah,
we have a similar. We mentioned before we started the interview that they're working with the bedrock as well. So, what do you make of this Jericho thing?
Well, I mean, to be honest, I mean, as you're talking to me about it, I'm pretty certain that one of the authors on that paper is Ram Bakai, of the University of Tel Aviv, who's a friend of mine. Basically, I spent time out with him at the Kesem Cave in Israel in 2019. I'm certain he's one of the authors on this, so I'm clearly going to have to, refine this, or I'm sure you'll send it to me. But yeah, firstly, rock architecture. The oldest in the world is Karahan Tepe. Second oldest in the world is Jericho. And I find that fascinating as well. I mean, and I think I probably already put in the book somewhere that there probably is a relationship between Karahan Tepe and places like Jericho. And, because what they did was they carved out this huge, great rock cut ditch around the central occupational mound. I mean, and it's, really cut deep. It's like a sort of the sort of thing that you would find, a hill fault, Bronze Age or Iron Age hill fault in Europe, for instance. It's that type of depth. Avebury, for instance, it's similar sort of thing. And of course, they were also constructing a huge, great defensive wall out of massive blocks of rock, and within it, this tower, which was probably a defensive tower, but it probably also had alignments to it as well. I'm sure I've read that there were astronomical alignments associated with the stone tower. And all of this is from the pre-pottery Neolithic period. As I say, this spans a much longer period of occupation, probably from, as you say, about 8,500 BC, right the way through into pottery Neolithic period. So we're going down to about 6,000 BC and beyond. But I mean, what I'm interested here immediately is that if this midsummer sunset alignment is significant at Jericho, were they looking at the same thing as what was going on at Karahan? In other words, were they also looking at, once the sun set a few hours later, the Milky Way being there where the galactic bulge would be seen? I mean, the latitude is slightly different, obviously, if you take it down into the Levant, but this is something I'll certainly be looking at as we move forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've just got the paper up here, actually. It's, Ram Bakai and Roy Liron came out in 2008. Midsummer Sunset and Neolithic Jericho is the name of the paper, and it came out in Time and Mind Journal. Obviously, with the winter solstice and with the summer solstice sunset, we find those at other sites around the world. Probably the most famous winter solstice alignment is Newgrange, which is only 5,000 or so years old, but it's got a similar, even that's similar to what you see at Karahan Tepe. You have a porthole stone there. You've got the light box where the light shines through and then moves. It takes 17 minutes to move through the chamber before it illuminates a certain area at the back of the chamber. We find some of the temples on Malta have this as well, like Manjara, Hagarhim, and others. Even Gigantia has some elements of the solstices involved in it. But even the Stonehenge, obviously the famous summer solstice sunrise alignment, but it also has obviously a winter solstice sunset alignment because it's the same direction at that latitude exactly, and that's the same path going through the site there. But it also has something discovered by Simon Banton and Tim Dorr. Actually has a winter solstice sunrise alignment there as well, which is less obvious, but it's there. And there's even notches carved out of the stone to allow the light through. And so there's a lot to think about here. And even went into Egypt as well. We have the famous Karnak temple, which is just 1,000, 2,000 BC. So that's even younger, but that's precisely aligned to the winter solstice sunrise. So all over the place, we're finding these areas and sites which use light to mark calendars, to mark time, at these specific locations. And I believe that's one aspect of Karahan Tepe. We've got the cosmic ideas and the symbolism and the snake, the serpents and things like this. But there's another element to this which I'm fascinated by, is the more practical agricultural calendrical side of it. I think this is partly, I think you've mentioned this before as well, where at the earliest phase of the whole Tepela sites, Gobekli Tepe, they were working with more the stars and alignments in the sky, and then they developed later into, around the time of Karahan Tepe, potentially into the solstices, which was partly useful, practical way to mark an annual calendar, which would be very useful for growing food and things like this, and keeping a track on time. And so I think there's that side of it as well to consider, as well as the more cosmic, more esoteric side as well. So I wonder what are your thoughts about more that side of things.
Yeah, I mean, let's look at it chronologically. When both Gobekli Tepe and Karahan were up and running, there was no widespread agriculture. This really happens probably around 8,500 BC. And suddenly, you have it there. And I'm pretty certain that they were creating beer and probably, food products using, domesticated forms of wheat in that area. I mean, I think it's something like 55 different modern varieties of wheat. Their DNA can be traced back to a wild version known as einkorn, found at a place called Karahan, which is within sight of Gobekli Tepe. In other words, this is unquestionably the place where the spread of agriculture began. Not where not where they first experimented with it, because they were experimenting with wheat crops in places like Egypt as far as 13,000 BC. Plus, there's evidence that the Gravatian peoples of Russia were looking into it as early as 30,000 years. But the widespread use of it doesn't come until about 8,500 BC. And what happens is that I think is that the yearly cycles become much more important to them from an agricultural perspective. So they are looking towards the sun and venerating it as the giver of life, the thing that they need to ripen the crops and for the seeds to grow and everything like this. So they start orientating certain of their structures towards either the sun at the time of the equinoxes or the solstices. But that's at Gobekli Tepe, and that's quite late on. For instance, you've got the Lion Pillars building, which dates about 8,500 BC, and that's perfectly aligned east-west, and there's no question that has equinoctial alignments. And at its eastern end, you have these two incredible felines, almost certainly panthers, on the two stones as you would look out towards sunrise at the time of the equinoxes. And I think that those panthers did actually represent that energy, that solar energy, and may well have contributed to why later this particular time frame becomes connected with Leo and the lion. You know, in other words, the panther becomes the lion. This period to do with the equinoxes is associated with Leo the lion. In other words, the age of Leo, you know. So that's that. Then you have enclosure F, and I showed that that was aligned to sunrise at the time of the summer solstice, or indeed, if you wanted, sunset at the time of the winter solstice. But these are much later than what's going on at Karahan. The rock architecture there, the three interconnected bedrock structures that they've uncovered, they're much older. They're 9,000 BC. So in other words, the interest that these people had in the sun is for different purposes. This is about synchronization with the movement of the sun and the cycles of the heaven itself. This is different. This is like, you know, you're seeing the sky revolving round all the time. And what you're doing on a microcosmic scale is doing what you can to synchronize and lock in to that cycle so that you will have this syzygy, this connection, this oneness with the cosmic source of what they can see going on in the heavens. That's different. And I don't think that's got anything personally to do with agriculture. Not at the beginning, maybe as time went on, absolutely. But I think initially the main function of this was a cosmological schema.
Okay, yeah, it is fascinating that agriculture developed after the building of Gobekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe and potentially some other sites in the region. I find that, you know, interesting. One of the ideas that me and JJ are putting forward in this part 2 of this article is the idea, and I talked about it in the Ancient Aliens episode as well, actually. So hopefully it's all in there. And so the idea that it was some kind of fertility generator. Now, this might not be a technological kind of thing or, you know, technology they were using, although it could be, because we have the work of people like John Burke and the fact that they found a magnetic anomaly in the middle of enclosure D, and we know that this could be used to charge seeds and grains. But certainly the symbolism and the whole kind of solstice cycle, the calendrical cycle, potentially is linked with like fertility and fertilizing the land, humans, animals, and plants, and may have been, you know, a ceremonial way of kind of doing this. People may have bought seeds there. They felt they were going to be charged up or enhanced by the god or the goddess, or by the energies there. We don't know. This is all like speculative, and it's all more research needs to be done. I did in fact take a tri-field magnetometer there to try and get some readings, but was unable to pick anything up with the limited areas that you're allowed to visit at Karahan Tepe. But certainly they've been recorded at Gobekli Tepe, which to me is fascinating. And so that idea, you know, needs more work, but there's more around Karahan Tepe that we talked about in Ancient Aliens in the episode on the site. I'll just mention a few little areas we visited, we looked at. One of them was the enclosure. I'm not sure what number number or letters the enclosure is, but it's the square enclosure would have had 4 pillars. One of the pillars has got 8 fingers potentially on each hand, and it's got these beautiful slabs on the floor, like a, you know, almost like a polygonal floor, really beautifully created. And the statue is very, very tall statue, but it's specifically got like the garment feature, the V-neck, and the 8 fingers on each hand. And I know Ancient Aliens, we did talk about that. Other people spoke about it as well. So and so there's more to this site. I mean, even the little amount, the 1% that Neshmi Corral says, there's much more to this site yet to be uncovered. There's a few new enclosures which they think are more domestic. This is what they're kind of saying a lot at the moment. But whether they're domestic, we don't know. You know, it's all up for debate. But yeah, the fact that one of them's got 8 fingers on each hand, and the fact that Neshmi Corral actually was quoted as saying that none of the statues they found at Karahan Tepe have actually got the correct amount of human fingers there should be. So what do you make of that, Andrew?
I mean, certainly as far as the 8 fingers, it's it's an odd one. There are no answers, in all honesty, at the moment. I mean, unless 8 was a symbolic number to these people, and we eventually find out that it recurs again and again, and if so, we can say, yeah, let's like looking into cycles of 8 and whatever. But from what I hear is it is all over the place. I mean, I can't say how many fingers the others got, but Nesmith Carroll, as you say, says that very few actually do have 5, the statutory 5, which is weird. So it may be, I don't know, it could be just some artistic trait that they adopted, that they could put as many fingers as they wanted, or there could be some specific symbolism in the numbers. But I think until we actually find some recurring numerological pattern, it's difficult to say. I mean, what does come to mind as we're talking about this is that on the top of Karahan there is a whole load of what they refer to as tally marks. Now these are a series of deep notches carved into the floor beneath us, as you look down onto the bedrock, and they seem to be in sequences, certainly in the way that Bahattin Çelik drew them, sequences of 31s. I think there's like 2 or 3 sequences of 31 and a 34. Now I know that Robert Schoch has spent some time looking at these, and believes that they're associated with the solar flare cycle of the solar cycle of 11 years. That may be the case. Who knows? I mean, we've got to look at this. I mean, you took a scan of this. I've got various photographs. At some point, we need to sit down, look at these, and just count them literally, and find out whether they are in batches of 31, or whether maybe Bahattin Çelik just missed out a few. We don't know. So we need to start building up patterns in connection with these sites. It's okay to say, look, here's a serpent. Maybe there was serpent worship going on. You can't really say that. You can speculate, you can think that that's a possibility, but then when you get another serpent, then another serpent, then another, and you eventually realize you're clearly dealing with a site where the serpent, the snake, was incredibly important. And we have to do the same with, let's say, numerology. We have to wait until we get sequences of certain numbers coming up, and then we can start applying those, let's say, to cosmic cycles, yearly cycles, maybe things to do with the cycles of the sun, the moon, the planets, etc., etc.
We also discussed the plates, the stone plates that have been found along the benches, around the benches at Karahan Tepe. Some of these are on display, some broken, some complete pretty much. And they're different materials. They're polished, very hard stone. And we were kind of intrigued by this because you felt there was some acoustical connection with them, that they may have been hit, because we attempted to do some acoustic kind of techniques at the site, which I recorded. You were kind of hitting certain things to see what came up, and the shape of it as well, like we find at Gobekli Tepe, is generally elliptical. You've got this elliptical there. I've done other research on the geometry. I'm looking at they are elliptical for sure, but I'm looking at the Alexander Thom geometries and finding connections there, which I'm going to write about in due course. But these plates are really interesting. I know they were talked about in the Ancient Aliens episode, but what do you make of that? Why were they placing these very beautifully polished plates, some with cut marks in the middle of them, around the benches? And why were they left there when they covered over and sort of decommissioned and finished with the site?
Well, okay, 2 different areas coming together here. I mean, firstly, the idea of sound. I think 2 different studies at Gobekli Tepe concluded that the enclosures, particularly enclosure D, may have been used, or certainly had enhanced acoustics, and that this may have been purposeful. Quite separate to that, myself and Rodney Hale looked at the whole number ratios of the various different enclosures at Gobekli, and the recurring ratio that kept coming up was 4:3. In other words, if you look at it in terms of units, there was 4 units on the long axis and 3 in the cross axis. And the important thing about 4-3 whole number ratios is that they're associated with the creation of musical intervals. That's the combining of two notes to create the perfect harmony or the perfect pitch. And you actually do this still. I mean, there are textbooks that suggest that if you're building a theatre, for instance, use 4-3 whole number ratios. I mean, I quote this in some of my books, and that tells me that there's a strong possibility that the shape of the enclosures was specifically chosen to enhance the natural acoustics. So that's at Gobekli. But then when we come to Karahan, the elliptical shape of structure AD, what I call the Great Ellipse, seems to also have a very specific whole number ratio. I thought originally it was 6-5, but 6-5 actually relates to the musical interval of what's known as the lower third, and this crops up again and again in Chinese, not architecture, but in the creation of certain instruments, these bells, where they specifically put this particular musical intervals, creating two notes to create the perfect harmony within these bells. Now, I find that interesting that they would use that in rituals and ceremonies. And here it is at Karahan. But the actual dimensions of it work better for a whole number ratio of 32-27, which I know sounds a bit obscure and out there, but actually that was the Pythagorean whole number ratio for the lower third. And if you use that for the shape of the Great Ellipse, it's almost exact, absolutely almost exact. And that by applying it to the enclosure, it highlights a cross axis and a long axis, and the cross axis hits at the back what's known as the southern recess. And when I say it's known, I mean that's what Nesmith Carroll refers to it. And in the back of that, there is a niche, a rectangular niche. And inside that, one of the major statues that's now on display in Llanllwrf Archaeological Museum was found. It's the head with two paws on its head that make them almost look like wings, but they're not. They're paws of an animal. That was found in that niche within the southern recess. Well, that southern recess, if you look towards the pillar shrine, you look straight through the porthole, through the central axis of it, and that line continues on to Gobekli Tepe, the northern Tepe, and beyond that, the northern opening of the Milky Way's dark rift, marked by the star Deneb in the constellation of Cygnus. And this relates very strongly to beliefs in the path of the Milky Way as a path or road or river to the sky world. And that's perfectly aligned. So, this geometry, I think, is real and really present within there. As far as the plates are concerned, what I'd already speculated, based on conversations with my good friend Richard Wald about, what might have been going on in the Great Ellipse, is that we both concluded that sound must have been generated in some way within it. So how would you generate sound? Well, so far, no instruments have been recovered from either Karahan Tepe or any other Taztepala site, to the best of my knowledge. But perhaps they made use of what was naturally present in the environment. And what you find is that there are some extremely hard, metamorphosized limestone rocks in the vicinity, which act as lithophones. In other words, if you hit them, you ching, 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 and it makes this incredible natural resonating sound. So if you were holding those and you had, maybe a something else, either a piece of wood or another stone, if you had, let's say, 20, 30 or more people doing this in some kind of cyclic sequence, you'd create a cacophony, which I'm certain would not only be enhanced by the natural acoustics of it, but that would send people into an altered state of consciousness, particularly if they'd perhaps enhanced that process using, let's say, hallucinogens or whatever, and that this may have been part of it. Sound, hallucinogens, connection with this cosmic serpent, becoming quite literally a snake in their own right. You know, in other words, becoming possessed by the snake. I mean, we're not just talking about, you know, praying to some kind of cosmic god and hope you get a message. You know, these deep shamanic rituals would have almost certainly involved people falling about on the ground, being possessed by snakes. And they would have given out some kind of oracular communication, probably very similar to what you have at places like Delphi, at the Temple of Apollo in Greece, where you would get these pronouncements, these prophetic statements, information, knowledge, wisdom, which I think is what was going on there. Now, whether this involved men, women, both, or what, I mean, almost certainly it was both. I think that, you know, you're dealing with a community that both men and women would have had their roles here, and that, you know, you have got this very strong feminine here, but you've very clearly got a male aspect and element to this as well, because whoever looks at those phallic pillars in structure AB, you know that you can't help but see them as phalluses, you know, or what you call penile erections. Basically, you know, they are erect penises, and you have to factor all this in with any rituals, ceremonies, and activities that would have been going on at this site as much as 9,000 years ago.
Yeah, they do look like that for sure. I mean, one of the comparisons I find interesting is to the Shiva lingams of the ancient Vedic tradition in India and other places in Southeast Asia, because the traditions there go very far back, probably not as far as Karahan Tepe, but there's a lot of similarities, not just the lingam shape, the phallic shape emerging from rock, but also it's often surrounded by water, and there has to be channels for water to drain out from it, like you find with the Shiva lingams. Often on high ground, many of them are placed. Also, as I know you've written about before, we're both fascinated by is the Navali Churi stone head, which has the kind of Vedic priest ponytail on the back of it as well. So you should grow one, Andrew. I think that would be the next move there. And I think there's some research. There was actually a really good documentary came out about 10 years ago now, which actually talked about that there may have been a Vedic connection there, but it may have been going from the Taztepala region, influencing outwards rather than coming in. So that it's actually something. It's in the part 2 of mine and JJ's article on the grahamhancock.com. So before we finish, there's one more thing I want to mention, because you came up with this very interesting reconstruction of a Denisovan recently, I believe, or Denisovan hybrid.
Yeah.
And there's a statue, which I think we talked about this on Ancient Aliens, with the big frowns on it and the big elongation at the back. It's in the Channel Earth Museum from Karahan Tepe. And there's been a debate about this, because people say, oh, it represents someone wearing a mask. You know, that's why it looks like that.
Yeah.
And the head would be further back. But you don't think so. You think it may be a representation of a specific type of human around back then. Can you mention just this as we finish up here?
Yeah, I mean, this is, and I'm sure you'll put this up on the screen. It's a very peculiar, elongated head with huge brow ridges, and an elongated, cranium, a cerebellum, sort of extended occipital bun at the back, and it's weird. It's caricatured, clearly, obviously abstract in some ways as well, and to assume that it's wearing a mask, I just think is wrong. I mean, quite clearly, this is a representation of something that was important in the beliefs of these people, and for me, it has to represent a great ancestor. And if that's the case, then what ancestors would have looked as peculiar as this? Well, as you pointed out, you find that the latest reconstruction by Sean Nolte of a Denisovan skull and the features of a Denisovan, based on every little piece of evidence that we've got, create a very peculiar looking individual that's quite unlike any of the other hominin reconstructions that have been done to date, particularly of Neanderthals, who, for the most part, in modern day, look like somebody you'd meet, as you walked down the road now. I mean, whereas these hominins, not being funny, they did look a hell of a lot different. And the Denisovans in particular were strange looking, very peculiar looking people. I mean, from all of the indications so far, particularly if you take something like the dragon man skull that was found in northern China, a place called Harbin. I mean, that's the largest human skull that's been studied by science, not necessarily that's been found. It's been much, much bigger, as you all know from the various books you've written, that there are much bigger ones. But this is the biggest one that's been properly scientifically studied. And even though the Chinese believed that it was some kind of brand new, human type, all the Western paleoarchaeologists, when they looked at it, said, no, this has got all the hallmarks of being a Denisovan skull. It even matches with the Denisovan skull that was found on the Tibetan plateau, a place called Zahi. And even the Chinese admit that the two, go together completely. So if you put the reconstruction that Sean Naughty has done with the weird head found at Karahan, they look very, very similar. The one from Karahan is like a caricature of a Denisovan. And why might this be important at Karahan, or indeed amongst Tas Tepela? Well, the official view now is that Tas Tepela began around 12,000 years ago. That's about 10,000 BC. And that various Turkish archaeologists are now beginning to realize that this journey of Tas Tepela did not begin in Anatolia itself, but came from much further east, as far east as Mongolia and Siberia. In fact, in the area of this huge inland sea called Lake Baikal. And this was the stomping ground of the Denisovans. In fact, it's even suggested that the Denisovans gave us a lot of what became anatomical modern human technology in the area of central Mongolia, particularly at a site known as Tolbar, which is directly south of Lake Baikal. And this was probably around 30 to 40,000 years ago. And that these ideas, particularly the stone tool technologies, were then carried westwards until eventually they entered into Southwest Asia and formed part of the emergence of Tas Tepela. That's what they're saying. But this was all in 2022, last year. But I said exactly the same thing in my book, The Cygnus Key, in 2018. Virtually the same evidence that they're now using. And quite clearly, they're coming at it from a different perspective. Plus, they are now also involving genetic evidence, which I didn't use at all. And I do think it's possible that the Tas Tepela culture is the very later re-emergence of human Denisovan hybrids coming out of the area of Siberia, Mongolia, and gradually making their way into Anatolia, probably via the Russian steppe, via the Caucasus, and then entering there, and then mixing with indigenous peoples who were already present in the region, peoples that were on the Zagros Mountains, the Taurus Mountains, further south in the Levant, the Natufian peoples, and possibly even peoples coming in from Europe, Magdalene peoples that were probably entering into Anatolia at this time. And the result of this incredible explosion of cosmopolitan ideas is Tas Tepela, Gobekli Tepe, Karahan, and all those other incredible sites that are now being uncovered by the archaeologists.
Yeah, yeah. As you said, there's a lot more being discovered. I mean, we did get a chance to visit some other places which are yet to be fully excavated. We're gonna hopefully be able to visit some of these on the tours we're running in 2023, like Sayburch, Jan Hoyak. There's obviously the museum is amazing, the archaeological museum in Shanlurfa. Obviously, Gobekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe, which are both you can both visit them now. But the excavations and the discoveries that are being made. I mean, we're in this process now. It's almost like we're in antiquarian times, like 200 years ago, of discovery. This is it. This is happening now. Sites are being excavated, discoveries are being made. These sites were buried and preserved, and they're starting to realize this now. Now, some of the sites aren't even going to be excavated for a few more years yet. And so, so what we've been looking at so far is just the tip of the iceberg. But we are running tours there. Andrew is hosting it with myself and JJ Ainsworth in May, 15th to the 27th of May. That's pretty much full, but we're running one in September, focusing more on the Eastern Turkey, somewhere Andrew's researched and written about a lot. Obviously, visiting all the Taz Tepela region as well. And yeah, we'll just finish up by mentioning, do check out this episode, this special episode, I think, of Ancient Aliens, that covers Karahan Tepe, that myself and Andrew were special guests on, as well as our good friend Taha, who's based out in that area, and many of our friends and colleagues were interviewed for it as well. And you can also hear myself and Andrew talk about this at Contact in the Desert, which is taking place in early June in America. Details I'll put below. I'm also going to be talking about some of this research, Alien Con in Pasadena in early March, Megalithomania in early May. But yeah, this is the time. This is a really good time to get out to these sites, to get out and explore them. So anyway, thanks for your time, Andrew. Thanks everyone for listening. Hope you enjoyed our kind of update of what we've been looking at and our recent visit to Turkey, and we think we've kind of got a lot of good new information. A lot of it we've not had a chance to talk about today, other sites we visited and so forth. But yeah, so if there's anything you'd like to add, Andrew, please do.
Well, just going on from what you said earlier, I mean, this is a time of discovery. Everything is in its infancy. Lots of people are coming up with theories and ideas about Taz Tepela, and this is the time to do it. I mean, nobody is necessarily wrong at this time. What's important is predictions about what will be found next. And if repeatedly, you're proved to be correct, then you're on the right track. And that so far, we've been spot on all the way along, since the 90s and the first understanding to do with this culture, right the way through to the modern day, now, this time. And come along with us on this. I mean, people who have been on our tours have discovered incredible things, unique things which have ended up in our books, in our videos, and have even gone viral in the case of the bone plaque in Shanlurfa Museum that shows two T-pillars, which the archaeologists had completely missed. So, yeah, I mean, we'd love for you to be there. We obviously use them as research trips as well. So they're incredibly important to us as well. And you'll learn as we go along. And that's really, really a significant and important thing to do.
Brilliant. Thanks, Andrew, so much. So check out Andrew's website, andrewcollins.com, also megalithomania.co.uk, all the information. We've got articles, we've got videos up on the Megalithomania UK YouTube channel, Andrew Collins, his channel as well. And we hope to see you out exploring or at some of these events. So thanks for watching Megalithomaniacs. Thanks again, Andrew, and we'll see you all soon.